is Clementine Barr. I'm an international relations student at King's College London, and I've been recently working with BizGees, contributing to both Arts for Refugees Media Hub and Impact Entrepreneur magazine. So in this episode, I wanted to explore a question that I think that is often overlooked in discussions of conflict. What does peace actually look like after a war is considered over? Because while peace agreements are often treated as endpoints, end stops for many people, for others, they're really just the beginning of a much more uncertain transition. So I think what drew me to this topic is this kind of disconnect I started noticing in how we study conflict and war. A lot of the focus is on outcomes, agreements, negotiations, institutional frameworks, and ideas at the overall state level. And of course those things matter, but they create the impression that once a conflict is resolved politically and on paper, it's also resolved socially. But that's not necessarily true. And what tends to be less visible are the long-term human consequences, how people rebuild their lives, whether they feel safe, whether they feel accepted, and whether they actually have the ability to move forward. So in other words, whether their basic human rights and needs are being restored in practice and not just recognized on paper. I've also become very increasingly aware that peace processes doesn't always address the root cause of conflict. They manage violence, but don't actually resolve inequality, exclusion, or mistrust. So it doesn't resolve the root issue that's actually contributed to the, most of the time, beginning of the conflict in the first place. So I actually became interested in what happens in that very gap between the formal peace and the actual lived reality of citizens. And Colombia actually felt like a particularly interesting case for that. So Colombia is widely described as a post-conflict success story. In 2016, the government signed a peace agreement with FARC, ending more than 5 decades of conflict between FARC and the government. And on paper, the peace process in Colombia achieved something very big, where 14,000 fighters demobilized and reintegration programs were created, and there was strong international support from actors such as United Nations and the European Union. So in that sense, the conflict ended. Physical violence ended against the group and the government. But when you look at everyday life, it's not very simple. And I think what interested me was the tension between that narrative of success and what the situation might actually look like, which is now a decade later. So rather than focusing on the agreement itself, I wanted to understand how former FARC members actually are experiencing transition to reintegration and today, and whether the conditions necessary for sustainable and dignified peace, things like safety, acceptance, self-determination, are actually really in place. So one of the very interesting things is how uneven the security experience is. So although the conflict with FARC formally ended, violence has not disappeared, but it hasn't disappeared for typical citizens or the government, but it has reappeared for former FARC members. In fact, over 460 former combatants have been targeted and killed since the agreement. And, that immediately complicates the idea that demobilization actually leads to safety. Because as one former fighter described it, delays in protection measures less than, as I quote, sitting ducks for other armed groups looking to settle old scores. So while the state no longer may be in direct conflict with FARC, individuals who have demobilized and been ex-fighters remain exposed to new forms of violence. From a human rights perspective, this raises a very fundamental issue where the right to security is not fully guaranteed. And without that, it becomes very difficult to talk about sustainable peace. And at the same time, there are significant challenges around social acceptance. One quote that stayed with me was very simple, was most people don't want us to work for them because of what we are. And I think that says something really important, where reintegration policies often assume that economic participation, for example, will lead to social inclusion. But in reality, decades of conflict have created very deep fractures within the communities. So distress doesn't disappear with a signature. And in fact, a 2025 survey actually found that 70% of former combatants reported ongoing risks linked to their reintegration, including threats against themselves and their families, where many choose to hide their past entirely to avoid exclusion. So while many individuals may be formally recognized as civilians, socially, they are often still outside the communities that they are trying to re-enter. And that directly affects the right to dignity and social participation and agency. And along this, there's also a more internal dimension, which is identity. So reintegration is not just access to work and services, it's about rebuilding a sense of self. And that becomes particularly complex in situations where people are not fully accepted in their new role in society. So the challenge is not only leaving behind a past identity as a former fighter, but being allowed to construct a new one. And all of this connects to the idea of self-determination, because having rights in theory is different from being able to exercise them in practice. If your safety is uncertain, if your community does not accept you, and if your economic opportunities are unstable, then your ability to shape your own future is actually very limited. So even though former fighters have formally transitioned into civilian life, their agency remains constrained. And then this is where the economic side becomes really relevant, because economic stability isn't just about income. It's tied to dignity, to independence, to long-term reintegration. So there have been significant efforts to support this transition, particularly those through cooperatives like ECOMUN, which aim to reintegrate former combatants into local economies. But what's interesting is that these systems often provide access to economic activity, but don't provide stability. So they provide participation, but not automatically equal income stability or life stability. For example, in one case near Caldono, there's a group of ex-fighters working in an avocado farm, and they face highly irregular income due to fluctuating prices, seasonal harvest cycles, and overall social stigma that affect demand. So even when people are working, their livelihoods remain very uncertain. And there's also deeper structural barriers in terms of the economy, such as land access. Land access for them becomes limited despite being a key part of the agreement, of the final agreement. And in a largely agricultural reintegration model, this significantly restricts the long-term viability and the sustainability of reintegration and the transition, and particularly peace. Similarly, financial exclusion continues to affect many former fighters. They struggle to access credit or banking systems, which are essential tools for building sustainable businesses. So what emerges now is a system where participation exists, but stability does not necessarily follow. And from a human rights perspective, this matters because economic insecurity directly limits autonomy. As one former fighter put it, he said that they promised jobs and education, but we are still waiting. So in some cases, this instability has even led individuals to return to illegal economies. So drug trafficking, for example. Not as a preference, but as a lack of viable alternatives. So overall, what becomes very clear in these issues is that these issues of security, acceptance, and economic stability, that they are interconnected, and that when one thing is missing, it affects the others. So reintegration is not just technical, it's social and structural. And I think we can see this as Gen Z, and we might look at this and see this is a very specific case. But this is at a more fundamental level, it actually reflects something broader about how we understand peace. Because there's often a tendency to reduce complex processes into very simple narratives, success or failure or conflict or peace. But through my research, it's very clear that this kind of framing is very misleading. In disinformation studies, this would be considered a form of oversimplification. Not necessarily false, but incomplete. It lacks context. So I think Colombia illustrates why that matters, because when we describe something as post-conflict, we often risk overlooking the realities that actually persist underneath this label. So ultimately, what Colombia illustrates is that peace is not simply the absence of war, the absence of physical violence against two groups, and is actually the presence of conditions that allow people to live safely, to be recognized with dignity, to have meaningful control over their actual futures. So nearly, again, a decade after the 2016 agreement, these conditions exist, but they exist unevenly and unstably. For former FARC members, reintegration is uncertain, it's ongoing, and it's shaped by structural limitations that extend far beyond the original conflict. So I think one quote captures this better than anything. Peace is not only the silence of guns, peace is also social investment, peace is guaranteed employment, peace is development, and this comes from one former member. The definition of peace is much more demanding, but also more accurate, right? Because without these conditions, peace actually remains something very formal and something written on paper, but not something fully lived. So I urge us to look further into these ideals and see what are the realities of traditional academia, of journalism, of media. When you see something as a success story, as a issue, a conflict, a war, peace, what's actually going on? Take a little research and see how peace processes are not linear, how they affect humans, and not just citizens that were affected by the war, but also people that were mobilized, right? Anyways, thank you very, very much for listening to my podcast and for the opportunity BizGeeks has given me to share this very important information and a very reality. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.